Next, we're going to move to planning business communications, the first stage in the stage of actually producing business communications. And to start with that, we've got the three-step writing process. The three-step writing process consists of planning, writing, and actually completing. And of course, this doesn't just necessarily mean writing. It could also mean an oral speech or presentation. The same basic three-step process applies as well. Planning includes analyzing the situation, what kind of communication is necessary, gathering the necessary information, choosing the way in which you're going to make the communication. In writing, that could be an email again, that could be a presentation, that could be an audio or an oral thing, it can be pretty much anything. Organizing the information, and then actually putting the message on paper or on video or whatever other medium you have, composing the actual message, and then finally the last stage, which is sometimes underappreciated or underutilized, is completing, which includes editing, includes revising, producing. You may write it first and then put it into a proper font or put it into a PowerPoint presentation, proofreading the message by editing it, and finally distributing it. These are the complex steps in a visual communications process or in a written communications process, and we will go through them step by step. First, you're talking about analyzing the information, gathering the information, selecting the manner in which you're going to communicate, and actually organizing it. This is all the first step. This is the planning stage. Analyzing is the idea, okay, what do I need to accomplish with this communication? Gathering the information, okay, I have to do research in terms of all the information that I have to put forth. In other words, I have to tell everybody what information do I need to tell everybody what they need to know. And organization, of course, is how am I going to put this information together? Okay. Then in terms of writing, the middle phase is dominated by adapting to your audience. Okay, I put down the information, but now how am I going to communicate this best to my audience, which includes being sensitive to the needs of others, the skills that I have in terms of establishing the relationship between myself and the reader. That could be a broad audience or it could be a narrow audience. It could be one person. Making sure that I have the appropriate writing style, composing the message, writing itself, which is a pretty time-intense thing, of course, choosing strong words, in other words, words that convey the message appropriately, creating effective sentences that flow well and communicate well, and of course coherent paragraphs. We're going to discuss all of this in more detail, but composing is essentially just the writing process. And finally, we have the last stage, which is completing the business message. In other words, once it's already written, you have the revision process, the production process. Again, that could be adjusting fonts all the way up to and including, using a powerful program like Adobe Premiere to make something into a well-oiled presentation. Proofreading and finally distributing. This is a suggestion in terms of how much time it takes. The planning about half the time, and then the writing and completing only 25% each. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. That's what the authors of your textbook think. I think the writing process is probably a little bit underrepresented in this chart. But again, that's, I think, there to drive home the importance of planning. Where if you just start writing out of the blue, you're going to end up going in circles, and you're going to end up putting in things that are not necessary. If you plan what you're doing first, it's going to be a lot easier to write something that is optimized, that's properly tailored to what you need. Okay, let's take a look now at the planning stage. And we're going to go through all three stages at various points, but we're going to back up for a second and go to the planning stage now. Providing the right information to the right people. Okay, what do I need to communicate? If it's a sales force that I'm communicating to, maybe sales figures or the sales strategy for the company. Other things that might be relevant to other people in the company may not be relevant to this particular group, and therefore I may not want to spend that much time researching and writing things that are not going to be helpful or relevant to the people. Delivering the information concisely is important. If I can communicate something in 100 words, it's better than communicating the same thing in 200 words. It's a lot easier for people to read, cuts down on their time, and makes it much easier for them to understand and appreciate and incorporate what you're telling them. Writing more efficiently is similar, and of course avoiding embarrassing mistakes is obviously important as well. So what is your purpose? That's the first stage, really, in deciding. Now, we're taking a step back and analyzing what our purpose. Okay, what are we doing here? Are we informing Informing means you're telling somebody facts, you're telling somebody a series of facts. Persuading, you're trying to convince somebody to do something. You're trying to convince your boss to adopt a particular policy that you have in mind. Or collaborating means working with a group of people. That's a totally different writing style if you're just telling people things on the one hand, telling people, trying to convince somebody to do something on the other hand, or on the third hand, trying to work together with people, make suggestions, things like that. How do you determine this? What are the sorts of things that you think about? These are all, kinds of questions to ask. Will anything change as a result of your message? If so, well, then you're probably trying to persuade somebody of something, or at least collaborate. Is your purpose realistic? If you're trying to convince somebody of something, is there a real chance that they're going to come over to your opinion? Is this the right time to do it? Is the purpose acceptable to your organization? All the kinds of questions that people should be asking. Again, you don't necessarily have to go through all steps individually, although that can help. But keeping these things in the back of your mind will become kind of second nature as you move along in your planning process. Who are you talking to? Is your audience full of people who are potential customers, directors in your company? Determining who your audience is, how big your audience, where your audience is, are all important things, to kind of give you a little bit of a better sense of what sorts of communication and what sorts of words are going to work best. Part of the audience profile is, okay, how well can they understand this? What is the level of understanding? What's the level of education? What are their expectations? How will they react to what I say? These are all part of kind of establishing the audience profile. Now comes the research stage, the gathering information stage. Now, gathering information, you have to look at, okay, what information do they need? Reading reports and other company documents, reading things from outside sources, reading whatever research you need to give you the profile of information that you think will be helpful to your reader. Listening to the community, which means getting feedback from other people, what sort of information they need. Let's say, for example, you're writing a sales manual. Well, you might ask your salespeople, your sales force, okay, what sort of information do you need? What sort of information is helpful to you when you're working on something? Those are all the sorts of things that are very helpful when it comes to determining what information you need to give over to your readers. While you're listening for feedback or watching for feedback, look at not only what do they say they need, but what does it sound like they need. Sometimes they might indicate some sort of a confusion of what's expected of them. So you can infer that what's expected of the people that are that are in the field are you can basically make a determination from their implied statements what sort of information that they need. Okay, so now you've sized up your audience. Now it's time to generate your tone, to generate what kind of style you're going to write with. So how you're going to focus depends on free writing or sketching, which again, that really just depends on how you're writing. That's not a big a deal. But then you're talking about what kind of information are you going to provide. Now, there are the 4 W's, the classic 4 W's when it comes to journalism, are who, what, when, and where. And then you have the why and the how, which kind of make the six questions, giving every element of this information to whomever you need. Thinking in terms of this 6 things. Okay, who am I talking to? I'm talking to all the salespeople. What is this? This is a suggestion for how to increase sales. When can this be put into effect? Well, this can be effected now or over the course of the next 7 months or whatever it is. And then to look at, what it is, where is this going to be effective, and of course, why is this necessary? Why is this going to work? How is it going to work, etc. Information quality is important. Is it accurate, not misleading? Is it relevant? And of course, does it avoid things like plagiarism and encouraging illegal or unethical activity? All of these things are important to consider as well. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next phase, which is selecting the best combination of media and channels. In other words, selecting the best manner in which to give this information over. So, what are the options to get information out there? It can be in person, it can be written, or it can be visual. I'm sorry, it could be oral, written, or visual. Oral meaning you're talking to somebody. Now, talking to somebody could be in person, it could be in front of a group of people, or it could be like a teleconference or a web conference or something to that effect. Written medium could be, again, printed or digital. It could be written out and distributed to people, and again, that might include things like an email, or it could be a presentation. A visual medium could also be like an audio or audio-visual presentation like I'm doing now. Again, it could be something that is handed out on pieces of paper like graphs and charts, or it could be digital like in an MP4 format like what you're seeing now, essentially. Each of these media have different advantages or disadvantages, and they have different mechanisms by which they can be done. An oral medium, which means obviously speaking orally, could be a one-on-one conversation, informal lunches. Again, these are just different possibilities. Digital channel of an oral medium, digital channel of speaking could be, let's say, podcasts, phone calls, voicemail messages. Again, obviously you don't want to, generally speaking, use communication with voicemail messages, but I guess sometimes you have no choice. Written medium could be either through print. Now, today, print, I don't know if print necessarily means the same thing as physical piece of paper. Probably an email message probably also counts as print today, or like a PDF format that's digitally distributed to everybody. Business letters, reports, proposals. Digital, in this case, means something that's less than, that's, kind of less formal. Tweets, text messages, content on a website obviously is digital. It's not specifically geared toward one particular individual, but it may be geared towards your entire potential customer base. Book length reports in PDF formatting. There's kind of a mix between this now. Today, and where in the old days you could give it out in print or give it out by email. Today, there's kind of a mix between them. I don't know if there's such a big dichotomy between print channels and digital channels. These are kind of really six mechanisms by which reports can be given out, and usually they're all going to be given out in an electronic way anyway. It's not that common that you're going to give a physical report into somebody. Maybe if it's somebody who you work with in your office and they don't like reading things off the computer, you can give it in text. For all, they can print it out anyway. But so all these things are just kind of different ways to do it in terms of written. Visual media, which means something that's designed primarily not necessarily to be read but to be seen, include things like diagrams, photographs, videos, infographics, animations, diagrams. All these things are different types of visual media, and any of these 18 different possibilities or 16 different possibilities or whatever it is could be used. And in determining who your audience is and how your audience is structured is going to help you determine which one you use. Now, communication on mobile devices is very efficient. They can be viewed at any time by anybody who you're working with. So obviously that's very important. But also, it comes with a little bit of challenges. It comes with challenges. If you're producing a video, you have to make sure that the text is large enough to be seen on a smartphone. How are you going to put it up? You can turn something into an MP4, which can be seen on a smartphone, but other types of presentations may not be that easily visible on a smartphone. Bandwidth, speed, connectivity limitations. In other words, if you're establishing something that you're going to upload, do you have the upload speed to be able to upload really, really big files, especially if it needs to be distributed quickly? Or is it this, it's one thing like, for example, you take a video on your phone, distributing it very quickly depending on where you are and how fast your connection is and what your data limits are. Those could be limiting factors. It's becoming less and less of an issue today. 4 or 5 years ago, this was a much bigger issue where people had slow connections. Now people have fast connections even from the road. Data limits aren't as strong as they are. Plus, Wi-Fi is much more commonly available in public domains than it used to be. So this is becoming a little bit less of an issue, but it's still something that's relevant. Other things, richness means how effective can it be in communicating a message. Something like a PowerPoint or video communication can be a little bit more rich or have more content, more, easier for the reader to understand what's going on, perhaps than a written communication. How formal is it? The limitations of whatever you're distributing it over. You have to consider that. If you're just putting it up on a file share site, you have to realize there are going to be certain limitations in what they allow you to upload, etc. Also, things like urgency. If something has to be done very quickly, does it make sense to have a really, really large file that may take a while to download, or that people who are outside of Wi-Fi might not be able to put on their screen? If somebody has a limitation of a couple of gig a month, and if you're going to upload a presentation or a video that's a few hundred megabytes, they might not want to download something if they're not on Wi-Fi. In which case, if you know that part of your audience is not on Wi-Fi and may not be able to download things, maybe they're on a plane or something, well, then you may want to distribute it based on just text. And if you distribute it based on text, it'll be a little easier to view. Cost, obviously, same thing. Security, privacy, these are all things that you want to consider when determining what sort of communication is appropriate. It doesn't mean something is always going to be appropriate in a given scenario. It varies based on what you're doing. Is it late in the afternoon before a weekend? Is it Monday morning? These are all things that you got to consider and that are going to vary on a case-by-case basis. All right, now let's look at organization. What kind of organization are you going to want to establish? Well, good organization is good. It helps the readers understand the message, rather than if something zips back and forth between topics, it's going to be much harder to understand. It also helps people understand, and therefore it increases the acceptance. It saves times. There are a lot of ways in which good organization increases the efficacy of your message and the respect that the reader has for you and for your message. Now, let's take a look at some different ideas, some different purposes that really depend on what the reason for your message is. If your message is to inform, you're going to establish it and state it one way. There's a difference between an idea and a topic. They're comparable. You can see some of the differences in this chart, but they're comparable in terms of how they indicate how you're going to communicate your message. How do you generate creative ideas? In other words, how do you generate ideas that you're going to use to solve a problem? Brainstorming, which means, sitting around a table or sitting around a computer or just, talking or going by email back and forth to figure out, different ideas among different people and see which ones work best. There's the journalistic approach, which means looking at the 6 questions: who, what, when, where, why, how, why, and how. Just in making sure once you answer all those things, that will hopefully lead to solutions of what you're looking for. Question and answer chain. That's usually an email thing where you ask, what do you think about this? And everybody responds, and everybody builds their ideas on top of another. Mind mapping, storyteller, those are mechanisms by which you can try to put on paper or put in a tangible medium the questions, what you're hoping to solve, and how it works. Limiting your scope means not trying to do too much. Limiting the information you present, limiting the level of detail, and limiting the length of what you establish. Not trying to do too much with a particular communication, and you're going to end up turning people off if you put in, and distracting them from what your core message is if you put in too much detail. Here are some suggestions for the direct approach versus the indirect approach. Again, the idea is that the more closely the more anxious or the more enthusiastic your audience is to get your message, the more direct your approach can be. You can, for example, when you start, well, if you're writing to an eager audience, an audience that really wants the information, you can just start with the main whatever it is you have to establish. Whereas if you're dealing with people who aren't that interested in your message, maybe customers, maybe people who haven't dealt with you before, whatever it is, start with a question that captures the attention. Start with kind of like a little bit of a hook. Do you want to make more money? Do you want to be more comfortable? Do you want to have a better life? That may be a little cheesy, maybe a little tacky. You got to think about these things, but you might have to start with something like that. Whereas if you're dealing with somebody who already knows they need the information, you don't have to bother with a hook because, well, the hook isn't necessary. Things like message body. If the people who need the information know they need the information, just provide the necessary information and don't mess around. On the other hand, if you're talking about people who don't care that much at the outset, then try to explain to them why it's important, explain to them why it's necessary, explain to them why your company can provide the services that they need. You may have to request action at the end if you're dealing with people like, please call me, please, do you ever see these commercials? Call before it's too late. They're asking that you provide an action, whereas if you're dealing with people who need to know the information in the first place, you don't have to ask for an action. They need the information, and they presumably know what they need it for. The outline of your content, this is all part of the planning stage. Build your message by establishing an outline of what are all the points you need to make. The first thing is you can put, okay, I need to make these 5 points. For each of these 5 points, these are going to be the supporting details. These are going to be the supporting statistics. You can use, again, an organizational chart. You can use, again, the tactics that we discussed before. Okay, and then finally, you can build reader interest with storytelling techniques. That's the idea. This is kind of an alternative method of communication where you kind of prime the audience here. Hi, don't you hate it when you try to slam on the brakes and your car doesn't stop? That may, and it may get into an accident and your insurance rates go up and blah, blah, blah. That's kind of the hook. Then the middle is, okay, how do we solve the problem? You need to get your brakes fixed, because if your brakes are fixed, then you won't have a problem braking. And then at the end, okay, this is now telling the reader what you really want the reader to know, and that is, come to Midas Brake Service, and we'll give you a really good brake job for only $39.99, or whatever the case may be. And that's kind of like you're using an audience, you're using the storyteller idea with the audience that really isn't that interested in your information, so you need a little bit of a hook. So then you need a call to action at the end, like we just discussed before. Okay, and we will see you in lesson 5.